Hello and welcome. You're watching the Tov Jewish News Channel. My name is Michael Wilensky and my guest today is Ziv Maor. Ziv Maor is a presenter here at Tov and in other places. Ziv is also a lawyer, so he's very knowledgeable in the fields of law and especially international law. So Ziv, welcome to our digital studio.
Hi, Micah. How are you?
I'm doing great. Our first question today will be about the hot topic, Israel being summoned to Hague because of alleged crimes against humanity that Israel has committed in Gaza. We know that the main accuser, from what I understand, is South Africa, which has summoned us to the Hague International Court. And I want to ask you, what is this case built upon? Is it presented well by South Africa?
No. Well, when you ask what is the case built on, the presumption is that there is a valid, logical, legal system underneath it. There is a case study, there is a variety of cases for you to learn from and to build your case against previous decisions in other instances. This is not the case. It is very rare for a country to be accused in committing genocide according to the Anti-Genocide Treaty. And in the way that this tribunal is built, it is completely impossible to do what us lawyers often do, which is trying to predict an outcome based on past experience. It is the first time for Israel to be so, and whenever it comes to international law, Israel is a unique incident. It has got no other basis to compare to whatever. So if we talk about this court, this International Court of Justice, I think that the only decision it have ever made that can consider to be a positive one with good outcomes, according to my judgment, would be deciding in a dispute between Argentina and Paraguay about some water resources in South America. When this is not a hot issue, a hot topic, a topic that divides the global community into axes, then you can expect an arbitrary body such as the International Court of Justice to have any validity or any moral standing to make a decision. But when the dispute is of the kind that is very so often divides the world into axes, then each and every country that sends a representative to the tribunal, supposedly in order to be unbiased when they come to decide in a case, they are all biased. They must be biased because there is barely any country on the globe that cannot find itself or position itself someplace on one of the axes at hand. So it's quite obvious to see where the representatives of Lebanon, Morocco, and Somalia will position themselves, and it is very easy to see that the representatives of both China and Russia would position themselves on the same axis. And on the other hand, it's quite easy to see how Germany and the United States will side with Israel. This is not how justice works, how law works, how courts are supposed to be working. And under these circumstances, it's on one hand very difficult to predict the outcome. On the other hand, it's very easy to see that this is not actually a judicial process. It is a mockery or a mimic of a judicial process.
Ziv, if the Hague International Court and especially these proceedings are not, highly viewed in the world of law, why did Israel accept to go there? Why did Israel say that yes, we will give you legitimacy by accepting your convocation to the Hague International Court and to present itself? What was the reason?
I will start by saying I have no good answer to this question. I do not know why our government made this miserable decision. This was not the decision I expected from it. Now, first of all, let me emphasize some false argument that was made in the past few weeks within Israeli discourse, as if Israel was obliged to comply with this court according to treaties that Israel has validated throughout the years. This is not the case. There are two relevant treaties. One of them is the treaty of the International Court of Justice, and when Israel obliged itself to this treaty, it emphasized and underlined the fact that it gives itself to the obligatory decisions of the ICJ, except in cases that regard armed conflicts between Israel and its enemies. There is no doubt that the current conflict, the current war between us and Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran goes under this provision that basically stipulates that Israel is not obligated, according to its own decision, to participate in a hearing in the ICJ. The other treaty is a treaty that Israel was one of its initiators back in the 1960s, which is the treaty against the crime of genocide. Now, in this treaty as well, it basically stipulates that Israel does not accept upon itself the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice. It is written within the treaty itself, and unlike the other treaty that I mentioned, here it applies for all the parties that signed this treaty. The mandate that the International Court of Justice receives from the anti-genocide treaty is only to trial individuals that are being convicted in their own countries in crimes of genocide. This is the mandate that the ICJ received in the anti-genocide treaty, and I am doing the very crucial distinction between the ICJ and the ICC, between the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court, which are two completely separate entities. According to the Anti-Genocide Treaty, the International Court of Justice only receives jurisdictions over individuals who were convicted by internal courts for such crimes. This is the only mandate that they receive. Israel never allowed this tribunal to decide in our cases in issues of war or in issues of genocide. So Israel did not have and was not compelled to participate in this mockery of a procedure. As to why our government decided to do this anyway, again, I have no good answer. The only answer that I can think of is not very positive, which is the will of certain individuals in our leadership not to leave after them a legacy of a country that is convicted in committing genocide. Specifically, Prime Minister Netanyahu, it's very reasonable to say that regardless of anything, this is at the maximum his last decade in control, and if Israel would be convicted in genocide during his regime or at the end of his decade-long administration, then it is fair to assume that this will stain his legacy, and this is something he would like to avoid. I would really want to believe that this is not the consideration that is made, that is to say that he sacrificed the greater interest of his state and his home country to try to tarnish his own reputation. I really do not hope this is the case. Either way, I cannot think of any justification for this miserable act on behalf of Israel.
Ziv, so let's get into the specifics of the case. What is the case put up by South Africa, and what is Israel's defense?
So basically, what is a genocide according to the treaty that South Africa relies on? It is basically a collection of felonies that are present and common in many countries' legislation. The most obvious one is basically murder. But if this murder is done in the context of trying to commit a genocide, that is to annihilate or obliterate the existence of an entire ethnic group out of existence, then this would establish an argument for genocide. Basically, South Africa looks at Israel's legitimate actions in the Gaza Strip, which are actions that countries at war commit any times that they are at war, including expulsion of civil population, including collateral damage in the essence of a civil population that suffers from such a targeting, and treats them as if this was indeed the crime, the internationally acclaimed crime of genocide. This has got nothing to rely on. But the fact is that, as I mentioned earlier, given that this is not a real court, but a mockery of a court, and given that the judges that sit in this tribunal are basically political representatives of various countries with their own agenda and their own affiliation and interest within the conflicts, then it doesn't matter how complicated or how baseless the arguments South Africa will make. They will find eventually judges that will accept those arguments. because this is not a legislative procedure on the kind that if you bring a baseless accusation into a court, you will find yourself not only losing, but also having to compensate for the cost of the procedure. This is a political procedure. And it is more like saying, for instance, that a person in the Republican Party of the United States, of the GOP, would have to decide whether or not a representative of the DNC is worthy of the public trust. This is a political question, not a legal question, and that's what it is. So it's completely pointless to ask to what extent is the argument of South Africa has grounds to it.
And what about Israel's defense to that argument? What are we claiming in defense?
Well, first of all, technically and legally, what Professor Shah demonstrated on Friday is that the actions as represented by South Africa do not establish the argument for a genocide, but they are completely legitimate actions of war in case of war. This was the first argument. So even if we accept the factual basis of what they said, this still does not establish what is legally needed for a genocide to be established. After saying that, Israel moved to the position of pointing the accusing finger towards Hamas and saying what Hamas did eventually, for instance, positively not distinguishing and positively targeting civilians, including not only babies but also fetuses and elderly and pregnant women, and doing obnoxious crimes of which we already know. By doing that, Professor Shah demonstrated that if there is anybody that should be accused with genocide, it should be Hamas. So these are the two grounds of the accusation. They're quite simple, by the way. This is a war that Hamas coerced us to do, and we do war. This is what we must do. This is what we obliged to do, not because of our free will, but because Hamas decided so. And the anti-genocide treaty is not designed to obliterate the concept of war. We all want wars to go away, but this is not the issue and this is not the point. We do war. We have to kill people. We're compelled to do so. But on the other hand, if the issue of genocide was brought to the table, then the accusing finger should be pointed toward Hamas, not toward Israel. This is basically the argument that Israel is presenting against that of South Africa.
Ziv, and in the worst case scenario, if Israel loses in the international court in Hague, what will be the consequences for Israel? Will we get, blockaded by all the countries? Will our soldiers who went on vacation be arrested in other countries? What will happen?
So we have to, first of all, distinguish between the two levels of decision. There is the final decision. It is not expected to be decided in at least 4 or 5 years, regardless of what will be the outcome of the entire war. This is the final resolution. What is currently at hand is an interim decision whether the court should order or not order Israel to withdraw from Gaza. This is the current question, and this is what the deliberations were about on Friday. Now, if the decision will be against us, which is completely acceptable, it will not be enforceable unless it will be also authorized by the Security Council of the United Nations. And this is something that is not expected to happen because, without a doubt, the United States will veto it. So the natural course of things, if the United States would have not been expected to veto the decision, was that the court decides that Israel must, with a writ, withdraw from the Gaza Strip. And then this decision is approved by the Security Council, and from this now on, there is a chapter in the UN Charter that designs the way that military coalitions would enforce this decision. But we are not expected to take this course because of the expected veto on behalf of the United States. But there is another thing that we are expected to see, and this is countries that will take initiatives and act against individuals, civilians, mostly reserve soldiers and officers that will do what Israelis often do and go around the world And if, for instance, we have an information about someone who crossed the checkpoint in an airport someplace in Europe, in a less than friendly country, say Spain or Ireland, that has proven themselves to be very inhospitable for Israelis and very unfriendly towards Israel in this conflict. So a guy crosses the border with his Israeli passport, then an intelligence officer in the Interpol or in the local police checks the Facebook profile of this person when he does whatever they do in Ireland or in Spain or wherever. And if he finds out that, for instance, in those Facebook profiles, you can see that he was actually fighting in Gaza, as hundreds of thousands of Israelis currently do, then he will find himself, when he tries to leave the country, being arrested by the police and investigated for crimes of genocide, which is a probability. And this is basically the more probable negative scenario that Israel should prepare itself for. And by the way, the ways to prepare itself is to retaliate. That is to say that if a country even thinks or demonstrates the idea that they are going to act in this way, then their diplomatic mission to Israel should be arrested on the spot. And their embassy should be denied the privileges of the Vienna Treaty that gives defense for such embassies. Israel must retaliate for only so and so friendly country that does so. By the way, Israel must also immediately retaliate towards South Africa. I do not understand how come we still have our own ambassador to South Africa, and how come the embassy of South Africa in Tel Aviv is still manned, and its representatives were not sent back home because of this mega damage that they are causing us in Hague. The fact that Israel reacts to this as if this is nothing, as if this is a simple dispute, and not South Africa taking sides against the worst enemy of the West these days. This is also a folly on behalf of our government.
Ziv, as a last question of our interview, I want to point out something you were just talking about, but make the question clearer. For me personally, it's quite shocking that the accusing side is South Africa, a country with a horrible track record of human rights. You know, if it would be Switzerland, a country with an impeccable track record of human rights, I would understand it in some way. But South Africa, where the leader of the second largest party, EFF, Julius Malema, was shouting, "Kill the Boer," the white population of South Africa, which is clearly a chant calling for genocide, and the South African government doing nothing about it, and also doing nothing about the quiet genocide going against the white-born population of South Africa. It's just crazy for me. How come the world doesn't see that hypocrisy?
Because because when you say the world, you have this assumption that the United Nations as an establishment is similar to the Knesset, is similar to the Capitol Hill in DC, is similar to some extent to the EU. This is not the case. The world, the global community, is assembled of countries that the vast majority of them, when it comes the number of countries, are non-democratic, very dark, very primitive regime. They couldn't care less about the human rights of the white minority in South Africa, as much as they couldn't care less about the rights of the black majority in the apartheid days. The track record of South Africa could not interest them less. This is an issue of access. This is an issue of the concept of democracy. Democracy and human rights threatens this axis, and this is why they side with them. After the apartheid regime was obliterated in the early 1990s in South Africa, this country was in a junction. It could have decided to become a democracy and to put all the very dark background that is implied on its dark history aside and march toward progress. Instead, they chose the path of reverse racism against the white. They have two neighbors, one in the northwest called Namibia, which is an African black country, very marching toward the progress, has a very vibrant economy, and its faces towards the west. And to the northeast, they have Zimbabwe, which is a very dark country with very dark future, and we all know what it's like to be there. We all hear that it's one of the poorest countries in the world. surprisingly, South Africa, post-apartheid South Africa, chose the path of Zimbabwe over the path of Namibia. South Africa is currently a member in the negative axis, in the axis of evil. They part with Iran and China rather with the United States and Israel. This is what they are, and I do not expect anything else from them because this is who they chose to become after the apartheid became a part of their history.
Maor, thank you very much for this interview and for your insight into the case against Israel in the Hague International Court. Thank you also to all of our viewers who saw this interview. Please don't forget to subscribe to us on all of our social media platforms and especially on WhatsApp, the link to which you see in the description to this interview. Thank you again and have a great day.